Hi, this is video lesson number 10 for Thursday, April 23rd, week of April 20th. All right, last lesson you concluded chapter 10, and we learned that as our nation grew, the differences in economics and culture increased sectionalism. We also learned that slavery was becoming a bigger, more dividing issue, and that the Missouri Compromise was a deal that satisfied both the North and South, at least for the time being, by creating an equal number of slave and free states. And you also learned that as the United States kept growing, we also started to assert ourselves more with our foreign policy. Americans started to settle in Oregon. We took Florida from Spain, and we issued what was called the Monroe Doctrine, where we warned other European countries to stay out of North and South America. In other words, don't start any new colonies in our neighborhood, if you will. So that was chapter 10. That concluded chapter 10. In today's lesson, I'm gonna talk about Andrew Jackson. Chapter 11 is called The Age of Jackson, and Andrew Jackson was, to that point in history, the most different president we had ever had. He was very controversial. He is still controversial to this day. And in this first section of chapter 11, we're going to learn about a little bit about Andrew Jackson as a person, the two presidential elections of 1824 and 1828 that eventually got Andrew Jackson into office, how he was as a president, and one of the biggest events of his presidency, which was the tariff debate of 1832. So, who was Andrew Jackson? Well, you know he was a president, but before Andrew Jackson was a president, he was a lot of other things. He was born poor. He was raised in poverty. He was born in South Carolina. During the American Revolution, his mother died. He actually suffered a scar on his face from a British soldier. According to history, so the British Army walked into the family tavern, and Jackson, who was probably about 12 or 13 years old at the time, was ordered by a British officer to shine his boots. Jackson refused and made a sarcastic remark to the British soldier, and the British soldier hit him with the backside of his sword. The backside of the sword is the dull side. Think of a steak knife. There's the side that's sharp and cuts, and then there's the side that doesn't. So Jackson was hit by the dull side of the sword, and he was scarred for life. At 15 years old, he left home, and he went to spy for the Continental Army during the American Revolution against the British. He was actually caught, but instead of being executed, he was released. The British commander who captured him felt sorry for him. Shortly later, the Revolutionary War ended. When Jackson got a little older, he moved out west. He gained a reputation for fighting Indians on the frontier. He settled in Tennessee. He became a lawyer, but he also became a leader of local militias and eventually became a general in the U.S. Army during the War of 1812. And he was famous for really two things. In the War of 1812, he defeated an alliance of Native American tribes at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. And he was the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. And if you remember from a couple lessons ago, the Battle of New Orleans was the biggest battle of the War of 1812. But it was fought weeks after the war had ended. Needless to say, people really didn't pay much attention to that. The fact that we won that battle and won it big gave a lot of fame and attention to Andrew Jackson. And after this, he would use his fame, he would use his reputation to work his way up into politics. And years later, in 1824, he's going to decide to run for president. Now, one thing about Jackson, what made him really different than other politicians of the time was his background. being born poor, being raised in poverty, working his way up to a position of leadership was something that was very rare back then. All politicians at that time were very wealthy men who came from wealthy families and did not grow up living lives of hardship. Jackson was different in the fact that he was, one, raised poor. He had no formal education. Most of what he knew, he learned on his own. Some say he really didn't read that well, although for all that we know, he could read. And also, he was from the West. All politicians at that time were from either the North or the South, but the West now was a growing region. And he was the first really well-known person to come out of the West to get into politics. And also, the last thing I'm going to mention about him, he was the first general to run for president since George Washington. So, being a general, a war hero, raised poor, not having a formal education, this made him totally stand out in the presidential race. And some people held that against him, but many people admired those qualities because they felt that he was more like a regular American. Next thing I want to mention is the elections of 1824 and 1828. Let's start with the election of 1824. 4 guys run for president: Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and John Quincy Adams, who, by the way, was the son of former President John Adams. Out of those 4 guys, nobody gets the majority of the electoral votes. When that happens, the U.S. House of Representatives holds the vote to decide who's going to become president. The guy who got the most popular vote, though, was Jackson. And in Jackson's mind, he therefore should have been voted the winner. He figured since he had the most popular vote, the House of Reps will take that into account and make him president. But that's not what happened. What happens next is what today is referred to as the corrupt bargain. John Quincy Adams, who is in second place to Jackson in popularity votes, tells Henry Clay that if he drops out of the race and supports him and talks people in Congress to vote for him for president, he'll make Henry Clay the Secretary of State. Henry Clay agrees. He does that. The House of Representatives votes, and they do vote for John Quincy Adams, who becomes the next president. When Andrew Jackson and his supporters find out about this, he's furious. He calls it the corrupt bargain, and he claims that John Quincy Adams stole the election. And really, for the next 4 years, Jackson doesn't keep his mouth shut, neither do his supporters. They continuously complain about losing the election. They accuse John Quincy Adams of a corrupt bargain. And also, John Quincy Adams loses a lot of respect. As more and more people find out how he won, they don't view him as an honest guy. And he has a really tough time as president. 4 years later, he's going to run for re-election in the election of 1828. And in this election, Jackson is going to destroy John Quincy Adams. He wins by a huge landslide victory. When someone wins by a huge number of votes in an election, we call it a landslide. Jackson had 56% of the popular vote, but most importantly, he dominated in the electoral vote. He had 178. Back then, that was a lot. When Jackson becomes president, I should say, there's a big inauguration party, and the White House is literally trashed. Jackson invites the general public to the inauguration, and thousands of people show up to the White House, and after a while it gets so out of control that Jackson has to be escorted outside the house into hiding until the crowd dies down. So this was a sign of things to come. It was a sign that Jackson's presidency is going to be like no other, and he wasn't going to be like any president that came before him. Now, Jackson as a president, how was he as a president? What did he do? Well, I'm not going to talk about everything he did or didn't do here because that comes up in other sections. But the first thing I want to mention is he develops, or what I should say is, he starts being called a lot by his nickname. His nickname up to this point was Old Hickory. He was called Old Hickory by men who had served with him in the War of 1812 and in battles against Native Americans. Hickory, if you didn't know, is a type of wood. It's a very, very hard wood. It's extremely difficult to cut. A hickory tree is harder to chop down than any other tree, and because the wood is so hard and so tough, Jackson was compared to it. Jackson was a mentally and physically tough person who overcame a lot of obstacles. He literally went from a log cabin to a White House and was considered a success story by many, many people. So, out of affection and respect, many people called him Old Hickory. One thing what happened while Jackson was president is more and more people than ever voted. And when I say people, though, it's not like when we say people today. I'm referring to white male voters. During the Jackson years, property requirements were dropped. In other words, to vote, as long as you were a white male, you didn't have to have property, which meant you didn't have to have money. So more people could vote, more men could vote for, white men could vote forever, more than ever before. But I do have to remind you that this was good for white men, but there were a lot of people who still couldn't vote. For example, no women could vote, African Americans couldn't vote, and Native Americans couldn't vote. So a lot of new voters took part in these new elections, but they weren't as fair as, an election of, say, today, where anyone over the age of 18 really can vote, so long as they're citizens. And then finally, last thing I'll mention about Jackson as a president was the spoils system. Jackson rewarded loyalty above all else when it came to giving jobs in the government. When Jackson first becomes president, he fires almost everybody in the government that's not elected, and he starts replacing them with his supporters. Some of those supporters are qualified and they do a good job, but unfortunately a lot of these supporters are not qualified and don't do a good job, and the only reason they get these jobs is because of their loyalty to Jackson. So that is something that is probably not a good thing about the Jackson presidency, but he's well known for. Last thing I'm going to mention is the tariff debate. Early in about 4 years into Jackson's presidency, there's going to be a major debate and crisis over a tariff. In 1828, Congress passes a tariff on imported goods. The South hated the tariff because it literally forced them to buy northern goods rather than cheap European goods. The South called it the tariff of abominations. They said that it was unfair. They said it was not constitutional even, and they claimed that they could nullify, which means cancel it out. When this happens, Jackson takes a very strong stand. The first thing he does is he says that the Union, or the country, United States of America, must be preserved. He tells the South that they have to pay the tariff. This is going to lead to a major crisis, almost a civil war. What's going to happen is Southern anger over this is going to lead them to refuse to pay the tariff. South Carolina threatens to secede or break away from the United States and form their own country. Jackson responds even more dramatically with what he does next. Okay. Jackson's going to ask Congress for a force bill, which gives him use of the military to enforce the law. He threatens to invade South Carolina, and he also threatens to hang John C. Calhoun, the senator from South Carolina who was leading South Carolina during this time. South Carolina backs down and accepts the tariff. But what's important about all this is what it leads to. Even though the South accepted the tariff and paid it, and Jackson and the federal government came away victorious, the South was still very angry with Jackson and with the tariff, and they were starting to get angry with the North in general. And the South learns that now the federal government isn't going to back down and is willing to use force. So the South learns that the next time they're going to make threats, or the next time they're going to defy federal law, they're going to need to have their own force to back up their words. But for the time being, Jackson shows all states that they can't do whatever they want, and his actions may have prevented a civil war in 1832. All right, that's section 1. And what I'd like you guys to do is to read about this in greater detail in the textbook, page 334 to 339. That's chapter 11, section 1. After you do the reading, there's some questions to complete on chapter 11, section 1. That'll be linked to the classroom page. And then there are 2 very short videos. The first video is of Jackson's inauguration. It's from an old TV or educational video series. So it's old, but it's good because it gives you an idea of what that inauguration was like. And also a short video clip on the tariff crisis. All right, so that's it. Make sure you get your questions in a timely fashion. Great job to all of you watching the video links and doing the questions. Hope to see you soon. In the meantime, stay safe, stay healthy, and stay connected. Bye.